Welcome, everyone. Welcome to this discussion between Anna Tregloan and myself this afternoon. Before we start, we'd just like to acknowledge that we live and work on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and we pay our respects to elders past, present and future. Please, ask questions. Anna and I very much wanted to do this as a kind of discussion. So just post questions in the live chat when you are able and if you would like to. And I think we'll just kick off. So, Anna, how are you today?
I'm good, thank you, Marion. How are you?
I'm fine. Look, well, I wanted to start by introducing ourselves. I know that, back when I was at NIDA so long ago, I can barely remember it, but people used to always give us their potted CVs, and that used to take up most of the session, and I always resented that. So I'm going to be really fast with what we've done and how we got to this point. But essentially, I got bitten by the theatre bug when I was at university. I went to Sydney Uni and joined SUDS, and really that was kind of the end of me. And I then applied to do the director's course at NIDA and did that. And following that, I was kind of lucky enough to get an attachment and affiliation with the Sydney Theatre Company, which in turn allowed me to start assisting. I was then lucky enough to get an assistantship with the then artistic director, Wayne Harrison, and that kind of took me right through to being resident director at Sydney Theatre Company. Then I left, had a couple of kids, went to the Bell Shakespeare Company where I became the associate artistic director, then was lucky enough to get the artistic directorship of Malthouse Theatre. And then after that went to the Australia Council, did a couple of years as the director of theatre in the Australia Council, which kind of gave me an insight into policy and all of that kind of world of government relations. And then finally left to become the executive producer of Performing Lines. So I stayed a director throughout that, but also took on other kind of cultural leadership roles in the process. And still think of myself very much as a director, even though technically my title is that of executive producer at the moment. So Anna and I intersected at first. Our first show together was called Venus and Adonis, and that was a co-production between the Bell Shakespeare Company and Malthouse Theatre, where Anna was resident director, and that was kind of where we intersected. So what had got you to that point, Anna, before we first met?
Yes, that was the way that you talked about that, it made it sound very linear, and I know that any career in the arts is never quite that linear, and mine certainly has not been. So I was a resident artist actually at the Malthouse. And that is the only full-time position I've ever held. Working for someone else, I've worked full-time for myself for a very long time. I graduated from VCA actually doing theatre production. There was design as a component of that, and I certainly majored in design by the end. But for me, it was important to kind of learn about the whole picture from multiple directions. Prior to that, I'd designed projects, but also performed a little bit, directed shows, sort of had been making theatre since I was well before I could drive. So after VCA, I went out and basically gathered more experience. So worked as a scenic artist and builder for people, designing small shows, and then kind of slowly building up connections and experience as I went along. In the process of that, or a while into it, I also went back to instigating and making my own projects, which are often performance-based, but they sit in a weird area between live performance and installation, sort of visual arts, and recently kind of archiving and community exchange. So yeah, sort of slowly working as a designer on, the projects slowly get bigger. And then Michael Cantor, when he became an artistic director, the Malthouse. I'd done one show with him prior to that, but he invited me to join the team as an artist in residence. And at that time it was me and Paul Jackson. There were two designers who were the artists in residence there. And yes, as part of that, the company did a collaboration with Bell Shakespeare, which was Venus and Adonis, which we did three. It had three, and was in Melbourne, and then later in Sydney, and then Auckland Festival from memory. Yeah,
that's right.
That was yeah. And then since then we've done another 3 shows together, and we were reflecting just before just how different each one of those was.
Yeah,
2 of them were based on Shakespeare.
Another Shakespeare, Taming of the Shrew, and but we also did an adaptation of a Dorothy Porter long form poem, really, called Wild Surmise, and we also did an adaptation of The Dragon at Malthouse Theatre. Yeah, we were reflecting on, you know, they were always kind of super stimulating projects, and we had great collaborations on each of them, even though you know, one of them was super successful, and the other one I think we'd kind of like put in our all-time, you know, lowest 5. But I think that's just kind of you know, speaks to the fact that collaborative relationships often withstand the sort of ups and downs of the responses, the various responses you get to a work. And you know, there's a great you know, one of the things, Anna, that I thought would be great for you to share with everyone, your career in particular is such a great example of, you know, having started out as a designer, and you still obviously design, but it's kind of branched out into so many different areas, and I guess mine has too over the years. And I think it'd be great for us to learn a little bit about, you know, what informs your decision when you take on a work, and why you choose one work over another. And also just how, I mean, I started out in text-based theatre. That was very much my thing, you know. I do anything but now, you know, and equally, you know, your practice is very varied, and moves from very localized pieces right through to sort of the curation of international design festivals. And
yes, there's a few things to say there, I think. Firstly, collaborations drive a lot of the projects I choose to do. I think that they are good collaborations are the lifeblood of the arts, but particularly theatre. It's definitely a group sport, team sport. There's only so much you can do by yourself, and there's certainly only so much I can do by myself. I have, because I do sort of drive my own projects, and some of them have sort of found me in a room, you know, building the whole thing by myself, and I basically hit a wall. Like, I need people to bounce off and work with. The other thing to say about collaborations, which sort of reflects on our history together, but all of them as well, that good collaborations are essential. I think good collaborations are essential to good work, but good collaborations don't always result in good work. There's so many other factors at play that kind of go into the whole picture and the final outcome of it. I think the shifts in my career are driven by a few things. One is I could say that it's sort of because I'm quite inquisitive, but it's also a bit because I'm fairly easily bored. So there's a part of it where once and a lot of it's also about learning. So once I understand and know how to do something, it's not as interesting to me as the next thing. So I do always try to seek out new experiences and new ways of doing things, and try to continually evolve my work. And that is also, and it's really kind of writ large at the moment in such a rapidly changing world. It's also about creating a practice that shifts with the changing landscape of the planet, socially and environmentally. And that I've never been interested in live performance, or most forms really, in the sort of museum model, or that sort of just reiteration model. It's I have a lot of respect for the people who do it, and there's lots of people who do it really well, but it's not something, I actually think it's something that I can't do. I'm not particularly good at doing that type of thing. My interests and maybe skills, I don't know, kind of sort of lie elsewhere. Yeah, so that has driven me to one, kind of look for complexity in the design work which I'm doing. So and sort of dig into the subject matter and build sort of nuanced and complex collaborative relationships as well.
Yeah, because I always feel that your work is part of a kind of continuum, that, you know, it expresses itself through various projects that you do, but they're sort of underpinned by a kind of really strong line of inquiry, and, you know, they're always a sort of an exploration of kind of bothersome questions, and you know, what you said about, you know, that interaction with the world as it's changing, I think is kind of super important. So I guess, you know, for me, that's, you know, the relationship to one's work and the bigger sort of producing context that you live in is critical. And, you know, it'd be great for you to talk a bit more about how you navigate that, and you know, what leads you to, what the kind of backdrop of the work that of the situation you're in, how that informs your work.
I think that, oh gosh,
I mean, it's probably
it's complex, isn't it?
Yeah, it's super complex, but I think maybe even the project that you're working on at the moment is a really good example of how that is. Anna's working at the moment on a project called The Impossible Project,
which is in fact an impossible project. Maybe just to reflect on the on that sort of question about complexity and the way that you navigate a career, and I think we all do this, is that part of it is becoming good at the art and becoming good at the craft, and probably having a natural affiliation for that to start with. But part of it is about learning the bigger picture, the way that the sort of cultural industries work, but then how that relates to the larger society as well. And as you go along, using that's a really important skill to build into the way that you go about making work, but also get worked up, and sort of knowing what's going to be useful to the world maybe, and what's going to be of interest to the world, but also the understanding how the funding systems work, you know, knowing how to write funding applications, and you know, who to ask the right questions to, and for me, making that part of the practice as well, so that, you know, I know many people don't, but I quite like writing a funding application because I use it to work through,
I do
to
too.
Frame it. But yeah, to use it to work through the ideas, and they're actually
it's a thinking mechanism. And it does make you really sort of grapple with, you know, the concept that underlies the project, and there's a certain amount of rigor that you have to apply.
And that'd be really different for, or you tell me if it's different for you now that you're doing it for projects which you haven't necessarily instigated, or other artists are driving a different part of it, because that's quite a different perspective on it. Yeah,
look, it is, and I love it even more, I guess, because there's an objectivity that I have that I don't necessarily have when I'm writing an application for my own work or trying to grapple with that. And, you know, I, like many artists out there, am kind of racked with self-doubt and, you know, constantly wrestling with those kind of demons. So it's really refreshing to be working with an artist where you can clearly see the genius in the work, and you can articulate it in a way that they possibly can't. So, you know, I think it's one of the things that's really important about the community, actually. And what you were saying about collaboration is that we we apply a certain objectivity to each other that you don't get necessarily in other more singular art forms. And I think that's, Anna, probably at the heart of what you love about collaboration, and why that informs it too, is that you want to be having people ask clever questions, and you want that sort of you want fellow thinkers, really, that are going to kind of exercise your creativity in a way that's going to bring out your best work.
Yeah, I think that you're quite right. It's about creating complexity, and what and I feel like I always know I'm in a good collaboration where you're not really sure where the ideas come from, who's the person who, you know, first put that idea on the table, because it's never just a this is what I think moment. It's always something which evolves out of conversations and grows itself to a large extent. Yeah.
But just on that that idea of engaging with the kind of broader context in which you work, you know, I know you've taken on also beyond your projects, you've taken on governance roles. You're very active in the Designers Guild. You know, I guess there's a cultural leadership dimension to your practice and what you do, and how I personally think that's really important for artists in this day and age.
Well, you're doing it as well, Marion, probably even more so, I'd say.
But tell me, tell me about those other functions, and you know, it's about understanding how to write a grant application and how those kind of mechanisms work, but you know, like the importance of advocacy and the importance of using your practice to actually inform the art form as a whole.
Absolutely, yeah. I think my practice anyway, and I don't want to speak for all other artists, but I suspect that it is current for a lot of people, is kind of about pushing into the future and making kind of sharing things with the audience, which allows them to think more deeply about something, but move forward with it. And I'd say that, yeah, the other collaborators, you kind of want to, theatre is often, and most art forms, about kind of pushing the conversation forward. And the type of advocacy I do, and the kind of associations that I have outside of actual practice, are a similar thing. They're kind of about pushing the conversations around how artists are treated in the industry or by government, but also the types of works that we're allowed to make or want to make, and actually kind of looking to the future, sort of trying to go, well, in 2 years' time, what is this going to look like, and how can we be empowered? And particularly my association with NIDA is exciting on that level. Hi, NIDA, because this is the future, and being able to be part of that conversation and see the way that things are shifting in policy levels, but then, you know, the way that the students are kind of working with these new challenges is also part of that future focus.
Yeah, I mean, I think most artists are futurists. You know, most artists live in that sort of imagined space that that sort of almost exists beyond our grasp. And I think at the heart of that is a real skill, and a useful skill that I think is undervalued a lot. I know that we're putting together an artist think tank at the moment at Performing Lines, just so that we've got people with those imaginative skills in the room to think about what a recovery plan for COVID looks like. You know, this pandemic has exposed so many kind of flaws that we kind of always knew were there, but has really exposed them in a way that, you know, we can't really move forward without addressing them in all conscience. And I think there's, you know, artists are professional imaginers in the end. That's what that's what they're paid to do, to imagine. So it's very important that we kind of keep underlining their value in the broader sort of sector, as people who have those that potential to actually help us think.
Which all of this, you mentioned the projects I'm working on at the moment before, the Impossible project, and then we got sidetracked, that kind of so much. That's why it's been such an amazing thing to be doing, actually, because it touches on lots of this. One is that it reaches out to artists across Australia and asks for their impossible projects. It asks for the visions of the future which never became manifest in any way. So it has been so fascinating and invigorating to have all of these ideas sent to me, but also, and it has shifted as a response to COVID in its focus for this year anyway. But also really embedded in the idea of it is this idea of imagining a future, and then sometimes you can hone it down so that becomes the possible or probable future, and sometimes it stays too open and it becomes an impossibility either side. And the project, although it's focused on the creative industries, is very much a metaphor for larger challenges and dreams and future planning for society. And attempting to reach a utopia, or at the very least a better world. It's absolutely has so many metaphorical sort of streams aligned to that.
There's one of my favourite Shakespeare quotes is from Hamlet, and it's we know what we are, but we know not what we may be. And I think it kind of suggests something fundamental about choice. I mean, basically, in the theatre in particular, we road test versions of ourselves imaginatively that allow us to actually kind of make choices about the kind of world we want to live in, the world we want to shape. But just on the impossible, on the whole kind of notion of impossibility and the challenge that comes along with that, there's a question in the feed that I just want to read out, and it's from Kate Murdoch, who says, what has been some of the biggest struggles that you've had to overcome throughout your journey? There've been a lot, Kate.
It's a long list.
I am a female director. One big one right there.
Yeah, exactly. And I've had many things that's even harder for a woman, maybe. It's actually interesting at this time because we both graduated round about in the early 90s, which was the last Great Recession. And those first few years out of college were certainly challenging. I don't know if I'd say biggest challenge, but definitely challenging, but also rewarding in the way that it was difficult to get funding for things. Budgets were not. They grew in subsequent years, maybe not enough, but they did grow. So yeah, that was definitely disheartening at times and difficult. I was working freelance all over the place. However, it also built those sort of experiences, and I think that's the thing with every challenge and being future focused, is they do build a real resilience in you as an artist, but also mean that you need to look, and it's probably built the way that I approach my work generally, they sort of build into you to be kind of looking and approaching things differently and trying to find creative solutions for ways to get work up and ways to manifest that work once you've got something behind it.
That
is
I mean, I've really appreciated the fact that in a way I've kind of had to work differently, harder, but differently to earn my authority. That there's a question here that's riffing on the same idea as just from Mara about how to deal with as a female director establishing a leader position, and Mara, you can't see me, but I'm 5'2". I'm kind of I would say reasonably introverted, actually, which is, you know, so, and I came into the directing world when it was full of kind of big people stamping their fists with loud voices, kind of asserting their authority in that way. And I, you know, could not have earned it that way at all. And what I found is that you actually had to be a hell of a lot more rigorous and think through that. You had to really kind of earn your authority by convincing people of the value of your ideas, and they were the key, you know. And if people kind of went, yeah, you know, I sort of understand where you're going with that, and if the line of inquiry was interesting, then it became a much, you know, it became a totally different dynamic, and one that wasn't kind of predicated on an assertion of power as an assumption. You know, it was actually about a collaborative meeting of minds or a complementary skill set. So it was actually a much healthier way to work, I found in the end.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. It is. I think that it is interesting to note that it is more difficult to sort of get the attention and trust of people. I feel like this has shifted over my career, which is in a good way, but I don't think it's quite over yet. But absolutely, yeah, sort of having to prove your knowledge rather than have your knowledge of something assumed, I think is a big difference. Like having to know so much more background than other people may have to get the same level of trust. But I'd also agree that you kind of use every challenge to your advantage, so that, you know, get to enjoy that complexity, and make it useful and make that a collaborative process is kind of, it's sort of the only way that I found through it as well.
And Whitney also asked, you know, if you find yourself in a mental fog or burnt out, what do you do personally to kind of get back on track or feel inspired again? What do you do, Anna?
What do I do? I'm a big walker, so I will frequently go for I'll go for a walk, and I walk quite a bit each day anyway, and I suspect that in some ways that kind of keeps me out of that. So I kind of, I'm a big believer in the thinking while you walk ideas and work through ideas as I'm walking along. And also, you know, you walk anywhere and you see the outside world, and it one adds stimulation, but it doesn't make it takes some weight off your quandary, I suppose. You realise that it's not, that it's still the arts. It's not the sort of be all and end all in many ways.
I find
kind of lucky.
I was just going to add that, I find deflecting the focus from yourself really important in those, you know, like I actually, you know, you can get so wound up and so introspective that, you know, as soon as you actually turn your attention back to the project or back to the world outside the project, it exists in a different space, you know, it's in a kind of, and that really helps regain your distance from it somehow. Sorry, I cut you off, Anna.
Oh no, that's okay. It's a similar thing, in that I'm lucky because I'm usually working on several projects at the same time. So I tend to structure my weeks so that I'm never sort of just in the one world. And I can, if I'm really at a sort of bottleneck with one project, I can turn to another and loosen it up in a different way. And I think the other thing I find, as well as looking to the outside world, is just trying different ways of doing, sort of approaching the same problem from a different direction, or using a different technique. You know, even if it's not necessarily a design problem, I might be trying to write it out and it's not getting anywhere, so I'll sort of try and draw it in a different way, or I'll read something from a different perspective about it. So just not keep, like everything, just keep moving.
And I think that idea of sort of constantly engaging with the outside world is important to feed your work as well. Otherwise it really just becomes about you and, you know, your one or two collaborate, you know, the people that you're collaborating with immediately. But, you know, it's important to read the newspaper, or, you know, read generally, but it's important to kind of take yourself outside of your comfort zone in many ways, not in a creative sense, but just in a social sense. Yeah.
I think that's really important to keep in mind, that the way that I think about creativity or the creative industries is that they're about an exchange with society. So it's really important to not be removed from, difficult to be in touch with all the levels of society, but to stay as connected as you can with the broader bits of society, and try and stay in touch with people from different fields, but just get out amongst us, as much as possible.
Yeah, and I think in the end, you know, we were talking a little bit before about what it is to live in a civil society and how important the arts are as an expressive tool that allows us to, you know, exercise imaginative choices over what we do. You know, fundamentally, the arts are about freedom of expression, and that is an incredibly kind of important thing in any society, which is why I certainly feel really strongly, and you do too, Anna, about our roles as advocates and cultural leaders, that sure, you know, we practice and we can get very sort of focused on a particular project, but we're always part of a bigger continuum and a bigger community that really relies on imagination and expression as a means to maintain a kind of civil society.
Yeah, and there's a particular challenge at the moment where there's such rapid change and big solutions needed, and the arts are having to find a new way to do that simultaneously. The way that the arts could be suggesting new ways of working in the year of the Great Lockdown is hampered. So there's a big but really interesting challenge at the moment to try and find use our sets of skills in a completely different way, but to still sort of get be a part of that political and social conversation, I guess.
Yeah, we've been talking a lot in our company about what it means to make hay while the sun shines, like literally, like what it means to avail ourselves of an opportunity in the moment and really kind of explore that in a sort of radical, extreme decision-making kind of way, and what it means structurally for how we do our work. You know, what if, you know, we were constantly at the mercy of of something completely random, like, you know, rushing out as soon as the rain stops to be in the sun is something that we kind of have to learn to do. And what that means for, you know, planning, does it mean that venues are no longer kind of a series of auditoria, but they're creative hubs and cultural sites that, you know, are much more of a kind of like gathering place for artists to develop work and to make work and kind of get stuff at the ready for when, you know, the sun shines and we can come together as audiences and artists instantly, and how we kind of can press go on that with a minimum amount of fuss.
Yeah, and the interesting thing at the moment is the I don't know, the sort of honing down into what is important in the experience. That so much of it is the work, but it's the social interaction that work enables and is a part of. Yeah, it's the sort of coming together of friends to go to something together. So it's interesting to think about ways that we can still enable that. When it's difficult to bring 500 people together.
Oh, my Siri's kind of going off. The pretext for coming together is really important, isn't it? That it provides us working like that. Do we have any more questions? If you'd like to ask a question, please do. Otherwise, you know, we'll just keep on chatting. I feel like you know, it's unprecedented, obviously, this situation, and people are feeling very kind of disheartened by it. And certainly, you know, what's happening in the arts in terms of our industry kind of being somewhat kind of forgotten. You know, the financial toll on our industry is huge, but what are the hopeful things, do you reckon, that we can focus on?
That we can focus. Well, I think I've already said if change is happening, kind of seeking out the ways to take advantage of that change. I think there's already been, so, you know, we're also faced with the environmental crisis preceding this, but this is probably, it's part of the same equation. So that kind of idea of you know, less travel, less cars on the road, a different way of doing things, like those sort of environmental impacts of that was kind of fairly notable straight away. But to sort of capture what we can from this, to work into that. And also, I do think there's it's a sort of amplified trends which are underway already. So I do think already there was kind of a different way or a different need of people to seek out community and build relationships and have conversations. And particularly once that was taken away, everyone went, oh, we really have to. But it's that there's something which I feel is already rebuilding. I'm having a lot of conversations that I wouldn't have been having before. I've sort of brought together groups of people who wouldn't have come together before, and everyone is getting a lot out of that. And I do feel like there's definitely something in that which we want to hopefully feels like we want to keep that with us into the future. And I can't see any bad in that, you know, that that actually we could have healthier communities, and also that people are kind of realizing that a lot of the sort of big over the top stuff and the decadence, which was sort of part of the world, isn't the key. That's not the key ingredient to a happy life. I think more and more people are, everyone sort of knew it, but this is I say, it's kind of amplified it.
But it's been really tested and proven to a certain extent. Yeah. But you know, you've always been very environmentally conscious in your work. You know, what are, just for some of the designers that are perhaps looking, like, what are some of the ways that you embed sustainability and environmental consciousness in your work?
There is quite a few angles to it, and like everything, it changes a lot with the project and the type of project it is, the way that the timeline for it works. My key sort of to it though is probably it's about the way that I have started looking at work. So I was able to spend a bit of time thinking about this, I don't know, maybe 7 years ago, and thinking about how we can actually build work differently from the ground up, which again, I think this is really linked to what we're looking at now. Like, we need new ways of actually not just changing the end product, not just changing the audience configuration or the number of people on stage, but actually how do we go from the idea stage, what do we change at that idea stage to be able to get to a better place all the way through the process. So for me, and it's easiest to understand in my own work because it just changes a lot in the design work with other people. But I've started building works that are reusable in themselves. So the Impossible Project one, the Ghost Project, which I've wrapped up for the moment, but ran for over about 4 years and had 12 different iterations all over the place. It's a single, it's the big idea which breaks down into small parts, and those small parts can fit in with each other. Bits of them can be reused. Each time it's done, it collects new input into it locally and works with local communities or local artists to enrich the project and add to it. So it's built as a kind of ever-growing responsive model that sort of reuses and reworks itself constantly. And the Impossible project will be the same. It's already the same. It had an iteration last year as part of the Prague Quadrennial, which was one idea. It was going to be developed this year, but in the face of COVID and lockdown, the whole concept of impossibility shifted inexorably. So it has had to be malleable to that and has reformed already. And once we do get back or get to the new place, it will shift again. And the idea for that is again that it kind of, you sort of build. I'm building blocks that I can rearrange and reuse. And I actually do similar things with. It's easier with companies that I work for a bit that build scenery in particular, which has kind of modular basis to it that I know that I can go back and reuse. It's actually quite an old-fashioned idea of flats and rostra being basic building blocks. See it slightly differently, but yeah, so building in things that I know that can be reused in future works. Trying to build in a modular way, as well as always, of course, kind of, you know, buying secondhand as much as possible, and then if it's not being reused, giving it back as much as possible. I think that's maybe the other key bit is particularly how, you know, way back when I used to keep everything from the shows that I do, and now I find new homes for it. It's less often recycling, it's more often kind of, you know, repurposing or calling out to people. You know, I once managed to move 6 broken pianos over 48 hours. They all found new homes and got remade into artworks or ended up in someone's back garden or all sorts. So it's more of that. It's actually a sort of a philosophy of finding locally and secondhand, and then also giving away locally and secondhand, and not being far less precious about things and far less precious about any ownership of objects in particular.
Yeah, I guess, you know, flexibility is the key thing there, and it's kind of such great sort of metaphor for what we're facing too. I mean, I found that at the moment, you know, the people who are, you know, the variety of the way of responses to COVID has been kind of staggering, and just, you know, I've found that the people who kind of manage to navigate it better than others are the ones who are comfortable with change and are comfortable with things being a little more open-ended. And it's, I mean, you spoke about linearity before at the very start. It's the, you know, it's the people who kind of see the world in a straight line are the ones who aren't faring quite as well, I find. And, you know, it's just important that we remember that art doesn't happen in a straight line. It never has. And to allow ourselves to kind of like be open to change, but also not think that there is an end point. You know, so they're kind of they're subversions of, you know, centuries and centuries of kind of conventional narrative structure and stuff like that. But yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, and I'm with you. I find all of that, and also with sort of, you know, a new way of making it, which is not that colonial model, the sort of, you know, text-based, frequently male writer at the core of it. But more diverse making models, which I'd learned a lot about doing work in Asia, was really eye-opening on that, which is kind of the whole performance is so key to certainly this is mostly in South Korea and Indonesia. It's really key to those societies, but the way that it's made, the path that it takes and the way that it works with the audience is quite different. So sort of shaking up that, absolutely, that traditional model All of those are exciting future paths.
Yeah, see, that's hopeful. I mean, just we have to wrap up, but I would just say that, you know, I still believe that there is something fundamentally hopeful about what we do, because, you know, creating something out of nothing is a hopeful act.
Yeah, absolutely. Cheers to that.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. I'm sure, you know, we can be contacted for any more questions, but, you know, I guess we both want to wish you the best of luck, and it's really important that we have kind of bright minds and, you know, thinking, politicized people working in our art form. Yeah. So good luck. Thanks, Anna. Nice to see you.
And take care. Thank you. You too.
Bye.
Good to talk. We should talk more.
We should.